Hello.
All right. I think it would be good to get started. Welcome to the second session on Tuesday. This is SEDATE. My name's Mark McFadden. I'm one of the co-chairs. Bron is the handsome one in the video. And what my goal here is to get the preliminaries out of the way so that we can have a good discussion. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you. Let's see here if I can do this. Here's the note well. The chairs are advised to stress the note well this time, and it's good for you to remind yourself of what's in here. One of the things that I want to take just a moment to do is to remind you of the fact that the work in the IETF is human collaboration, and as a result, that collaboration works best when people are respectful to each other, understand the fact that they have different backgrounds, and so one of the things to know is that we have guidelines for conduct, we have an anti-harassment policy, and we also have a group of people who are both trained up and willing to help address any harassment issues. So I put this slide in the slide deck just as a reminder to all of us. I don't think there's a problem in SEDATE. In fact, I know there's not a problem in SEDATE. But if you experience this either in SEDATE or in any other working group, you have resources to use. And as a code of conduct for the rest of us, I think this is particularly important. The agenda here, I'll do a little bit of agenda bashing, but not much, because I really want to focus entirely on the document that we have, and I'm going to basically turn it over to Karsten to do that. I have already talked about the note well. As I said, we have the working group has a single document. That's the one we're going to talk about. Let me just talk a few minutes about a liaison. Here's some potentially useful information. There is a GitHub repository where the pull requests are being collected for our document. And of course, the charter is in the usual place, can be found on Data Tracker in the usual way. Our charter talks about a liaison, and the chairs have had a conversation back in August with the IEB to request a liaison to TC39. The IEB agreed in the beginning of October to go ahead and do a liaison. That process is a formal IAB process that basically got kicked off on October 5th. The IAB asked for candidates, and on October 22nd, the IAB had a list of candidates, volunteers, and has started interviewing those volunteers. I do have information that some of those volunteers have been contacted by the IEB, and the IEB is hoping to make progress on that process quickly after IETF112. So unless there are questions here, I think that what I'll promise to do is I'll promise to keep the mailing list informed about the progress for this liaison, because as you know, we're trying to make progress on this document fairly quickly, wrap up the working group fairly quickly. And so one of the things we said to the IAB is we need progress on the liaison in short order as well. So that's my update on the liaison, and my promise to the working group basically is that as I hear things from the IAB, I'll continue to let the mailing list know about the progress we're making on the liaison. So let me just pause for a second and see if there are any questions. Okay. Well, I'm pleased to say that the meat of the agenda is to be turned over to the discussion of our one document. This was, as you know, adopted as a working group item the last time we got together. There's a new version available, -1. Karsten sent out, Karsten has actually done a lot of work, and I'm not going to steal his fire here, steal his thunder. I'm going to just let him talk in a second. You can see the mailing list for the outline of issues, and in the last 5 days, there has been a really healthy and I think really positive discussion on the mailing list, and lots of good proposals. And so without any further ado, let me turn it over to Karsten. He has some slides, and I just would like Karsten to manage the discussion. Let me stop sharing my screen.
Okay, so you now all should see my slides, and if somebody enables it, also me.
Those look good.
Yeah, I look good too, but you can't see it. You have to...
No, you need to turn your video on separately if you want to do that.
Yes, I did a video request. Oh no, I didn't.
You've done a screen request.
Screen sharing. Yeah, VTech can be so confusing. Thank you. Sorry about that. Okay, so let's jump right into where we are. So on October 20th, we had a new version of the draft. There are some 8 issues open on GitHub, which maybe don't cover the whole ground here. So I proposed a structure of discussion with 5 points, 1 to 5. But given what has happened on the mailing list, I inserted a point 0, which we probably have to do before we go to 1 to 5. And the point 0 is what are we doing here anyway? The charter tells us that we are extending RFC 3339 timestamps, and where we could do this to provide additional information, and that's actually what the charter talks about. Or we could also do this to actually change the semantics. So the timestamp on its own means something different than the timestamp with the extensions that we have added. So just to remind people what 3339 does for us, it gives us a UTC timestamp, and it gives us the ability to add an annotation, which is a time zone offset, a numeric offset, that allows you to understand which time zone this particular time was meant to be in, but not in the sense of a human readable time zone, but just in the sense of a time zone offset. And yeah, it's a matter of syntax that when you do that, the time that you actually look at no longer is UTC, but is in that offset. But that's that's not a semantic thing. It's just the way this is represented. So I try to summarize what happened on the mailing list. In particular, I'm referencing this particular mail, which you unfortunately cannot click on, but it's one of the most recent mails that were sent on the mailing list. So on the annotation side, where we keep 3339 unchanged, but just add more information, we certainly have the proposal to add a human readable time zone. So I can say that some time actually is in the Europe-Berlin time zone, and not just that it's plus 0100 or plus 0200, depending on the time of the year. And of course, there are also other annotations, display hints, and so on that can go there. And but the point is, this is still a 3339 timestamp, just with some additional helpful information. So any 3339 implementation can be modified to just ignore everything that is in this new extension syntax, for instance, by ignoring everything that starts with a open square bracket, and we have perfect interoperability. But we also have been talking about other things, including modifications. And in particular, there is this thing that was called B in this list, where we have essentially the same information. You have a 3339 timestamp plus a human readable time zone, but we actually mean that the human readable time zone overrides the time zone offset if the semantics of that human readable time zone changes from the time the timestamp is generated to the time the timestamp is consumed. And there are some details how you can do this, but I think that the point here really is this is a kind of timestamp that is a little bit wobbling around based on politicians' decisions, but after a while it actually converges to an actual timestamp. It's just a little bit more difficult to interpret it because you have to have access to a current time zone information database. So that's something different from the annotation thing. That's why I called it modification thing. And then, of course, there are other modifications one can think about, for instance, timescales. I think that would be a really useful thing to have, but still it's a modification. So again, if we say this looks like an RFC 3339 timestamp, but it really is in TAI and not in UTC, that's changing the semantics. And finally, there have been new semantics which are not covered by the concept of a 3339 timestamp at all. So not a fixed point in time, or at least a time where we can converge to a fixed point after a while. So for instance, a floating time, which is a timestamp that only becomes one when you add local context. So it's not interpretable without that context. Of course, the data structure that this timestamp is integrated in, that might provide the context. So you can still have full interoperability on these timestamps, but the timestamp by itself is quite different from what a 3339 timestamp would be, even if it syntactically looks very similar. So the question really is, should we be doing modifications and completely new semantics, so that the points B and C on the previous slides, in this working group or not? I'm not talking about what the charter says about that. I can read the charter, but should we do that? So is that something that is better done in the context with the other extensions that are covered by A? Of course, once we do this, one interesting question is, should this still look like a 3339 extension, or maybe should it prevent false interoperability by looking sufficiently different that a 3339 implementation is not going to misunderstand it for a 3339 timestamp. So the argument or my argument I would use for doing 1 and 2 is that we could make sure that these modified or new semantics could actually mesh very well with what we already chartered to do, which is A. And yeah, just to remind people, you all have the charters on your laptops, but just in case we need this for the discussion that sure will start now, I have put the relevant parts of the charter on 3 slides here. Ron.
Point that I would make with all of this. Am I live?
So the queue is open. Thanks for that introduction, Karsten. And Bron, go ahead.
Yep. So the only point I would make is that if the time zone name can override the offset, then we're already in the space where the time plus offset, the timestamp or exact point in time, is not fixed in place. And as soon as you're doing that, you may as well do all the floating stuff as well, because at that point you need to read the context to resolve exactly the timestamp. It could shift depending on context, and once you say it could shift, then we should do all the could shifts. But I'd be happy to also define something that doesn't allow the time zone name to override the time point if that's what we want to do. But yeah, one or the other, I think, not half and half.
Okay, Neil?
I just wanted to say, yeah, the thing is that some of these things are just not timestamps. They're just date times. But that's fine. There's a lot of applications on the web that need date times with a time zone, or date times that's wall clock time that doesn't have any time zone associated at all, and defining a standard way of serializing those is good for interoperability, and that's what I thought the temporal group were looking for when they first came to the IETF with this proposal. So I would say it's fine for it, to not be the same as 3339. We just don't say it's an extension of that. We say it's a separate thing. It's just adding more standard serializations for common things on the internet, just like 3339 did.
Thanks, Neil. Watson?
Cloudflare. So I would argue for B1 over B. And the reason being that if you don't see the offset, you don't know how to understand the time zone, an implementation will realize it doesn't have an offset. But if we have the time zone override the offset, in cases where those differ, the implementation that understands the time zone will think it's a different time than the one that's actually specified. And that would be unfortunate. Especially in cases where like there's user entry, that can happen. I do want to say though that is also time zones. Time zones since 1970, more or less, are not going to change retroactively. So if you have a past time, let's say in Europe, Berlin, just as an example, the offset for that time is known. And it's not going to shift. Although future times, there's a whole question about how do you know what time it will be in the future? Well, you don't. But that's not really a concern. That's more a calendaring thing.
Yeah, I think the observation about be it B or B1 is that the time zone info database content is going to change over time. So the interpretation of that date time, timestamp, whatever, is going to change. But as you say, it's very unlikely to change retroactively now. So the interpretation is going to converge into something, at least, a small time after the timestamp actually happened. So that's still different from a floating time, which is entirely unfixed.
I just want to say the semantics are entirely different. If I am living in Berlin and I write down that it is 1 p.m. Berlin time, then it is 1 p.m. Berlin time. And whether or not 20 years later, people are confused about what the offset was, the time I wrote down is the same. So saying that, you can't have the two cases. If you actually want to have an unambiguous UTC thing, set your clock to UTC and keep your timestamp in UTC. You shouldn't have a time zone if you want your timestamp to be a UTC one. Uncertainty about offsets, looking back, is an intended result of putting in a time zone.
I think Bron next in the queue. Or out of the queue. Maybe I'll go to Ujwal.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. I just wanted to first quickly plus one the point that was just raised by Watson. I think the core distinction between
Ujwal,
B
we
and
still
B1.
can't hear you. Maybe I will let you resolve any audio problems you have. And
I can hear him.
I can hear him.
That's weird. Maybe
Yeah,
some
I could also hear it as well.
thing. Okay, maybe Mark, you could try refreshing or something like that. Oh, or he cannot hear me.
He can't hear you. Mark, you might need to refresh your audio. Let me ping him.
Okay, can I continue?
Yep.
Okay, I was saying that one of the sort of promises that we make in the in the RFC, or sort of tentative RFC, is that the implementations that don't understand any or all extensions would still resolve the time, exactly the same way. It would just, have difficulty with other operations. And I think that promise is somewhat broken if you allow B, but B1 sort of doesn't have that. So it ties back into the point Karsten made about, do we want them to even be interoperable with 3339? Maybe it's it's not good if you want something else, maybe it should look different so that there's no way that there's a mismatch or something like that.
Yeah, I still might want to share code, so some similarity is probably useful. Michael?
Oh, yeah. I just wonder if this emphasis on times just being in the past is misplaced. I mean, people are going to publish future times which are prone to having the time zone rules change more than people think, I believe. And when you track time zone in certain areas of the world, time zone specifications change quite a bit, and at the last minute. So I don't know, you can guarantee that any offset you've put in there is going to be valid when you actually come to the actual point in time. It may be more true that they don't change in retrospect, but I don't think we're dealing with that all the time.
Watson?
Watson again. I think it's important to understand what people mean when they specify future times. If I say I'm going to meet you at 12 p.m. Grand Central, I mean when the hand of the clock in Grand Central Station, both of them are pointing straight up. And whether or not that is a certain offset from UTC isn't really the problem. And so now what the issue is, what happens if you're specifying this for a region that suddenly changes the way it keeps its clock? And that's a very thorny problem because it requires predicting.
Wait a minute though. Before we go too far down that road, I get your point. If it was real meetings, real people in the same time zone, the problems occur when you're trying to set up a meeting that's in different time zones.
But what time zone do you want your meeting to be specified in? If your goal is to have
you each want your time it to be your time zone. What you agree on, what the contract you make is to meet at the same instant in time, which can be ultimately expressed as UTC. There's a thing you said which is absolutely correct. What matters to people more than anything else, what is the invariant to people is their local time, not UTC. So when you say you want a meeting at midday or 2 p.m., you mean midday or 2 p.m. local time, your time. But if you're meeting with somebody in a different time zone, they are meeting at, say, 8 a.m. in the morning. Now,
right, and
for you to meet,
so
UTC has to agree.
Maybe we are all pretty familiar with that problem. So I think
yes,
we all
but
agree that that problem exists. The question really is, what is this working group trying to do about it?
I understand that, but expressing, say, these times as UTC or a fixed offset doesn't resolve those problems, because if the rules change, then the UTC has to change.
Yes, I think everybody in this call is aware of that.
I think I don't think saying that you're going to have local, I think that problem's inherently insoluble. You don't know whether next year, let's say it's a meeting between, say, someone in Arizona and someone in California. You don't know whether next year one of them changes time zones, or it changes the date at which the thing happens. So something has to shift.
Yep, and it's the offset.
Yeah. When you schedule an
But
event,
if
you
you-
say which time
Which
zone.
is why I say the offset is the wrong thing for future times.
I completely agree with that.
Now, there's a use for having the offset and the time zone ID in that you can detect that they no longer agree, and then you can actually do something about it. And what you have to do about it is you can't just automatically fix it. You have to reschedule those things.
Yeah, I think we really
That's
have determined that this use case exists. Let me just put out the other use case, so why maybe you understand why this is not quite as simple. The other use case is that I have a certificate and I want to be able to say when that certificate runs out. And there it's usually not useful to factor in decisions of politicians, but you want to have an absolute time when that goes away, so you know when you have to install the new one instead of it. And I think people are pretty adamant that the times they put into certificates actually mean something very specific. So both use cases exist. RFC 3339 is kind of leaning towards the let's have an actual point in time. So that's the problem it solves today. And what we are trying to find out here is what are the additions we can make and where do we make them? And what we probably don't need to discuss is whether the problem exists. I think we are all aware of that.
Apologies, I claim to be back. And I don't know who's next in the queue here. Is it Michael?
Sure, go ahead.
I think most of what I wanted to say is redundant with what you just mentioned. But yeah, I just wanted to point out that we already have agreement that both use cases are legitimate for different applications. It's just that we already have a way to represent a instant in time. If we know exactly when the certificate expires, we can already represent that in a format, right? But we have no way to represent, let's meet 9 a.m. in Melbourne time. Like, that's not something that you can do in the standard space right now. And so the question is not as much as is this even useful, but like, do we want to do this? And if yes, where should we do it?
Yeah, it may be useful to point out that there are other standards that already provide that. So somebody cited the iCalendar standard on the mailing list, so that provides a way to have a future time in the sense that B, that's called B here.
Yeah, so I think we've gone around in circles enough on this to say that we should, I guess, decide whether we want to work on it or not. That's really the question ahead of us, is should we do that? This question one here, should we do a time that is not an exact point in time format in this working group? I don't know if we need to do a poll for that to decide. Our charter doesn't specifically allow us to do it, though we could do it by basically doing the options that I proposed, which are not making any changes to the RFC 3339 bit, but having things that could add an additional offset to it, basically, that gets calculated by the time zone rules changing, or by whatever, by floating, which says resolve it in your current context, whatever that happens to be. So what do you think, Mark? Should we do poll on this, or should we just ask people to speak on it? I'm aware we're already halfway through our time slot.
Yeah, we're halfway through. I'm puzzled. Maybe a poll. Let's see here. A poll would be, although I think
the important point is that if we want to do 1.2, we need to initiate a rechartering process quickly. And we need to be very certain what the scope, what the extent of that rechartering is going to be. Do we actually include C, for instance, or is C out of scope and we only do B? I think that's something that we should be deciding pretty soon. All of this doesn't have to stop us from doing A and actually even maybe finishing and publishing an RFC that does A. But I think that people are so interested in this other use case that we need to develop a position on it, even though it's not in our charter.
so. I think scoping would be extremely important if we rechartered, especially in. It'd be very important to make sure that we are explicit about what is out of scope. That's just one person's opinion, and that's without my chair hat on. I think the scoping conversation, while you say would need to happen very quickly, and I agree with that, I think what'll be very important is how the scope is limited, right? So I don't know, Braun, do you have any thoughts about that?
I mean, we would basically have to say that we're creating the same extension for both a point in time and a floating date time, and that the floating date time is not replacing 3339. But it can be used with the same contextual extensions that can be used to resolve it. The problem is that this is taking even longer, and temporal is already. We promised them we'd try and get something so that they could actually bake this stuff into web browsers. So yeah, Ujwal, I think what you should speak to this.
I was actually just asking Karsten how much this would delay us. I as you pointed out, we've been working on temporal, and we would like to be shipping out soon. And I think it would be really sad if we have to ship something that's not standardized. I would not prefer that at all. So we should try at least as much as we can to take the fastest route. One thing that I was thinking is that if rechartering is going to take a substantially long time, one thing we could do is that since a large number of these different derived formats, so to say, are useful mostly in the calendaring space, we could do that sort of reification in Calixed, and then change the draft that we have here to not only link to 3339, but also to that and say, okay, this can extend all of these formats, not just the timestamp format. What do people think of that proposal?
So maybe this is the time for our esteemed AD, Francesca, to say a few words. Sorry for putting you on the spot.
No worries. Do you have more precise question? Because I mean, except saying that rechartering would, in my opinion, not be quick, and yeah, it would take some time, especially if you go to the next slide. I think where you had the charter. Was that the one after? Yeah, no, I don't know what slide it was that had the current charter on. Here you go. Yeah, given this, the current text and the effort that it took to get to this charter, yeah, I would be careful about, like, if there are time constraints, rechartering might not be the best idea. But I'm just listening in to what everybody's opinions are. Or Carsten, did you want me to?
No, I
say
think
more,
your estimation for how long a rechartering would take is very important in this discussion. So if this is something where if we came up with a very, very specific scope, we could make it happen quickly. That would
Okay.
make push the decision into one direction. And if we find out this is going to be another red hole, it would push us in another
Okay,
direction.
so from a purely process point of view, a rechartering should take around, I believe, something like 6 weeks if everything is already in place, and this 6 weeks should start in the beginning of December, at least. So that's at least 2.5, 3 months, and that's assuming that everybody can agree on rechartering text and the scope and motivation and evaluation. Yeah, that is also mentioned in the current charter, so that's important to do. Yeah.
So I would expect us to take about the same time to fix up the documents. Of course, we couldn't make one document a working group document before the recharter is at least in a definitive stage. Again, the other thing we could do, or maybe we can do both at the same time, is write up the case A here and make sure all the mechanics for actually defining extensions are already in there. So we just have to add this one little ingredients that we're actually doing things beyond 33, 39 at the time when we are chartered to do that.
I think that's an interesting way forward, because one of the things that we could potentially do here is immediately start working on draft text for rechartering, and then also schedule an interim so that being sensitive to temporal, that we're making clear and definitive progress, right? That we're not waiting until March to make more progress here. Although I think I want to say again that the conversation that's gone on the list in the last 5 days has been really constructive. I do think having an interim might be a way of pushing the work forward a little more quickly. And that's something I'll bring up at the end of the session. But I can actually see 3 parallel tracks there, right? Is continuing work on the existing document and putting A into it, working in a track where we recharter, and then have an individual submission to actually deal with, for instance, B1, so that we were making forward progress in parallel with rechartering. That's one approach anyway. I don't know if people have any comments about that strategy.
Works for me. I guess the other question for the temporal group is this useful to you in this shape without the ability to do floating time, or the ability to have the zone override the offset?
I guess I could speak to that. The idea is that temporal does have those semantics, but then because temporal is in a special situation where it is a programming language API, so there's more ways to represent that. So in this case, we of course do not allow the this information of saying, okay, the time zone overrides the offset be represented in the interchange format, but then the programmer can specify that on their end, so it's like still doable, and therefore we don't have a pressing need for this.
All right. In that case, I think definitely pushing ahead with this document with timestamps only makes sense. And also doing the rechartering in parallel, because we can publish this one without rechartering.
I have is that if we publish this one with what we have right now, let's say, would we need to say, push a new version obsoleting this once we have the other document published, so that it says, okay, it can extend both? Or can we do that in some way right now by saying, okay, this applies to any derived formats and not just that specific format?
Well, I wouldn't write it in such a way that it has to be obsoleted. I mean, if we have a pretty good idea of where we are going in the next step, we can make the first step go into the right direction. So it would just be another document that is added to it. And
that sounds really, yeah, that sounds really ideal. I think the way I hear it, it doesn't delay the document we have, and it allows us to start working on the supplementary document right away. So I think I really like that idea.
So with my chair hat back on, I'm hearing gradual consensus there. I want to make sure that the mic is open for other points of view, but there is this emerging consensus that we continue to work on the existing document and move it forward as quickly as we can, in parallel with a rechartering process that is has a very brisk scoping, and then also the beginnings of the new document for, like I said, B and B1 here, B or B1. So it's basically 3 parallel tracks that the working group would proceed on. Let me just leave the mic open here and see if there's anyone else that wants to talk to that planned path forward. I will say editorially, what's nice about that is that continues to get us towards a work product relatively quickly. It really addresses the issues that have come up in the last 5 days. I like that a lot. And I'm not afraid of the rechartering process. I think that work can be done after IETF112 to move reasonably quickly on that. Although everything that Francesca says about the rechartering process is true, all the process that it has to go through. So let me just pause here and see if anyone else wants to come to the queue. Wow, I see no one. Okay. So I'm going to assume that we have consensus on that path forward, and that someone has very bravely made a note of what we've decided. Let me just make it, Karsten, you're okay with that as a way forward?
Yeah, I think we have lots in place that can make us generate a document for A, and we should simply do that. And this allows us to get, for instance, the syntax issues out of the way before we actually go into the semantics issues that may make B or C a little bit more complicated than it seems at the moment.
Okay, that's fine by me. It was wrong.
That I wanted to sort of ask about from the chat is that if publishing this document that we have right now is not blogged on rechartering or the second document, do we have a pressing reason to do anything very quickly? Because I think temporal can ship after we have this one published, right? So
my understanding here is that we would move quickly on the existing document, and we have in the charter we have a timeline that suggests that we would get a document to the IESG by December. I think that is aspirational at this point, but that's a conversation that I want to save time to have here at the end of our session. And the reason that I keep stressing parallel development here is because I am sensitive to temporals, timelines, and I'm also sensitive to the fact that when we were chartered as a working group, we were chartered as a short-lived working group. We don't want to, I don't want to put words in Francesca's mouth, but we don't want to be in a situation where we're sort of like barnacles on the side of a boat, sort of adding to the charter over time, right? We want a clear and fairly succinct scope. That would be my answer to your point. I think I have John next in the queue.
Mark, I just wanted to make a quick procedural observation on something you said, which is that, especially given some of the people who are not participating in this session, possibly because of conflicts with other working groups, we don't have consensus on anything until it's confirmed on the mailing list.
So, John, I completely agree with that. I was simply talking about consensus in the session, and we would obviously take back any discussions that we had in the working group meeting back to the mailing list for a consensus call. I completely agree with you.
I just wanted to make certain that was clear, and I assume you knew it, but I want to be certain it was clear to everyone else.
Yeah, let me be very clear about my intention, and the reason that I was hoping that Bron was making a note there is that if we have a clear and succinct understanding of what the proposed path forward is, that I would take the responsibility of getting that out to the mailing list in short order and asking for discussion and potentially consensus around that path forward. Again, John, knowing that I'd like to drive that consensus as quickly as I can.
I hope we're all in favor of that, and thanks very much.
Cool. We have 13 minutes left to address all the rest of these slides, so we probably should keep moving.
Yeah, I think the interim is really needed. So my hope would be that we actually can get the document in a state where it actually shows that this working group can get things done at the time the final decision about rechartering needs to be done. And so this is an incentive, another incentive to do this quickly. So should I go to the other slides?
Please do.
Okay. So I think we have 5 areas where we need to get work done. And the first of all is, of course, the overall format. So we already had some discussion about ASCII versus UTF-8. I don't want to open that discussion right now. I just want to remind people that we have to have an opinion on that. Maybe more important is that we need to explain what it means to receive an extension you don't understand. So if all extensions are annotations, that's actually simple. Once they actually modify the meaning, that becomes a little bit more complicated. Even an annotation may be something that you really want the recipient to understand before using the time. So yeah, in many other protocols, we have something like must understand flags or something like that. So I think that's an area where we need to understand what we need to do or what we want to do here. Yeah, and finally, the thing really needs a name. Could somebody please invent a name for this? Any comments quick comments on this? Okay. Yeah, the time zone extension, I think, is pretty clear what that is. In particular, if it's just an annotation, then I think we understand that. So issue number 3 is already answered by the discussion we already had, and maybe we have to spend a little bit of time thinking about forward compatibility issues. Here, so what do you do with time zone names that actually are deleted from the database and so on? But I think apart from that, this should be a slam dunk. Now, the next question is naming the other extensions. And the current draft has a pretty complicated mechanism, so you don't name any other extensions. You, first of all, delegate namespaces to different organizations that then run registries for extensions within that organization. Sounds complicated. There's also consideration that names usually start out as somebody making an experiment, and then this experiment grows and so on. And if we have names that try to reveal that this is experimental stuff, the X dash will continue to be in that name. You will never get rid of it again. So I think we have to think about how we run these registries a little bit more. But my proposal would be to get rid of the whole delegation thing, because that leads to a complicated mechanism of making another organization act in a way that this document describes. And I think we can just skip all that and create a single registry and make it reasonably easy to actually register something there, or maybe reasonably hard if we want to, but we have to decide on what's the threshold we want to put in there. There is a concept of a single character namespace, which is currently only provided for the Unicode consortium. And the text seems to imply that a single that any Unicode specification automatically can define or automatically already defines an extension mechanism for the timestamp, and I'm not sure that actually works. So the U-CA that is given as an example here, that doesn't really tell me enough to write software to handle this. So again, my proposal would be to just get rid of this, make sure that we have a good way to take in extensions from the Unicode consortium, maybe require them to spec them out in a way that they actually are usable in the extended format we define. And yeah, the last slide here is about the multi-character namespaces. I already said this is more complex than it needs to be. We could still reserve extension name prefixes. So if we say U- goes to Unicode, that's probably a simple thing to add to this registry. But apart from that, just having a registry for information elements that could be added by an organization that writes a specification, which includes the IETF itself, of course, sounds much simpler than what we have now. Comments?
Okay, Ujjwal, go ahead.
Thing that I was sort of clarifying on the chat was that the whole procedure that I have seems rather convoluted. In hindsight, it was something that I borrowed from BCP 47, so I don't feel strongly in favor of it or anything, and I'd be happy to take in any simplifications.
Okay, that's helpful. Go ahead.
There's a comment in the chat about vanity registrations and so on. So I think it's pretty clear that we have to have an expert review type mechanism here, and the job the poor designated expert would have to do is fend off vanity registrations. So I think that's standard material, and we know how to do that. And I don't think this is particularly more attractive than other targets for people. I'm not going to talk about one particular person who has been very visible. I think we can handle that.
Yeah, and I would say that my experience with IANA is they have a lot of experience in this area defending against vanity registrations. John, in the queue?
going to respectfully disagree. IANA has had problems with that kind of thing since Postel handed over control to a committee, and they resist things where they're forced to make those kinds of decisions. And designated experts do not work where there's serious controversy, as distinct from trying to make things consistent with a set of norms about how they're described. And this meeting conflicting with the media type one is a real disaster from the standpoint of having this discussion. I would expect that if you said designated experts are going to make these kinds of decisions among competing entities who are interested in registering names, that you would get resistance from IANA, and you would probably, if they're on their 12, get resistance from the ISG. This is a tough problem. Now, I agree the designated expert ought to be able to reject nonsense. If I decide I want to register a thing called John, which is time zone wherever I happen to be standing at the moment, I would hope a designated expert would be able to beat me when they had enough to discourage that registration attempt. But if you get two legitimate attempts to register the same string with different semantics, the system is not good at dealing with that.
Well, at least it will make sure that only one of these registrations goes through.
Well, then the traditional solution to that is to go to first come, first serve, but that raises its own set of problems.
No, this is not a candidate for first come, first serve.
No, it's not. Absolutely.
Yeah. Let me see here. I know we have 4 minutes left, and I do want to reserve a couple minutes to talk about future actions here. And I understand John's point and respectfully disagree in some cases here. Let me just leave the queue open one last time for any further comments about Karsten's last 5 slides here. Okay. What I'd like to do then as chair is summarize what I've heard and just get a thumbs up from Bron that this is the way forward. So what we're going to do is take to the mailing list a commitment to continue to move forward on the existing working group document and try to do that at pace. The second thing is we're going to have a conversation on the mailing list about rechartering and potentially asking someone to do an individual submission that meets additional requirements that have been identified both in this meeting and in the last 5 days, so that we have a path that has 3 tracks. One is the existing document and continuing to make progress on it, and then 2 other things, a working group recharter and also another document. I note, and as chair, this is something that concerns me and Bron as well, that we have in the charter for our timeline, we have a deadline of delivering our first document to the IESG in December. And what I'd like to do now is sort of have a reality check about getting that done in December and see if anyone has any comments about whether that's doable or we should revise that date.
Well, we need 2 weeks for the work group last call. We need 1 week for Thanksgiving. We need 1 week for the holidays and so on. And we probably need a couple of weeks to actually do the work. So that's pretty aspirational, I would say.
Yeah, I'm tempted to say the same thing.
How do we feel about February next year?
That was going to be exactly my contribution. If we make it February of next year, one of the things the working group could decide to do is have an interim in January to sort of clean up and truly finish the document prior to working group last call. And so I like the idea of February of next year. Let me see if there's anyone that wants to get in the queue to talk about that change. Okay, like the others, that's something that I will take back to the mailing list and propose as a change. The last thing that's on my agenda then, and I know I'm at time here, is how do people feel about the chairs organizing an interim meeting in January?
I can reply to that. I would actually have one in December and one in January, but that's maybe just my kind of working.
Who else in the queue? Go ahead.
I was wondering if you could do one sooner.
Well, let me do this. Let me talk to Bron offline about the timing of that, and if he and I can make it work, we'll try to have one in December. What I would propose is that if we do one in December, then at that December meeting, we would decide whether or not we need another one in January, rather than scheduling both of them. I think it should be on an as-needed basis. While I do agree that in order to make quick progress on the existing working group document, I think an interim in December would be useful. I just want to make sure that we can get the interested people there. Does that seem right to you, Bron?
Yeah, I think so. We'll sort out a some kind of poll and work out when we can get the bulk of the key people there.
That sounds like a good path forward. Okay, we are at end time here. Is there any other issue that someone wants to bring up? Well, otherwise, on behalf of the chairs, thanks to everybody for another intriguing conversation. I'll be posting, as I promised to, I'll be posting things to the list. Probably try to still get some of that done today and tomorrow. And then Bron and I will have a conversation about how to get started on scheduling an interim in December. With that, thanks to everyone, and talk to you soon.
See you in Gather, possibly. Some people
Yes.
have decided we're going to go chat there, so might catch you over there.
See you over there.